In this lesson, let's talk more about dynamic routes. Now, dynamic routes allow you to define routes that can be dynamic. Dynamic as in things that keep changing. In our case, a dynamic route would be something like this, wherein this specific ID keeps changing. And this ID is there to uniquely identify this specific coffee shop. So this ID starts with 4C something something, right? If I go back to home and click on some other coffee shop like Superjet, it starts with 5AE something, right? So each coffee shop has its own ID to identify that specific coffee shop. Now, in our case, anytime we need to create a new route, we create a new file, right? Because Next.js uses a file-based routing system. So each coffee store right here is essentially a dynamic route. So we don't want to create 6 different files, that is NiagaraCoffeeShop.js, SuperjetInternational.js, Grip.js, BluestoneLane.js, and so on, right? What we want to do is that we want to create one page that is dynamic enough that each coffee store can just route to it, like in this case, and somehow the same page gets rendered. And that is possible through dynamic routes. So how exactly can we define a dynamic route? It is via a bracket syntax. And these are the docs for dynamic routes, so definitely check it out. But let's go ahead to the code and let's create a dynamic route. Now, in our case, we can easily create a dynamic route by using a bracket syntax. But before we do that, let's go to our browser and check out the URL. In the browser, it's coffee store / the value, right? So what we need to do is convert this specific file into a folder so that we can route to it. So we can do coffee store and let's move this file in there. Now, as we do that, the routing has changed a little because if I go to the browser now, if I go to coffee store, it's going to say it cannot be found, right? And the reason for that is we don't have a default route inside this folder. It is actually coffeestore.js. So let's say I change this to index.js. Because remember default routing, this was the first route that we learned. This is the index route. So anytime we have a /coffee store and we want that page to be the default page inside that folder, then we need to call it index.js. So now we are back to where we were, right? We are seeing coffee store page rendered right here. But in our case, what we want is we want coffee store / that specific ID. So in order to do that, what we need to do is use bracket syntax. So we can rename index.js to id.js, and anything inside the bracket would be the value in the browser. So I'm calling it an ID, but we can call this slug, foo, whatever we want, right? And we will take a look at how the naming of this file can be used in a future lesson. But for now, let's just call it ID. As I do that and I go to the browser, I can do /1 and there you go. It still goes to coffeestore.page and it did not return the 404 page. And that is the beauty of dynamic routes. So if I say whatever, right, it will still return coffee store page. And that's because of this specific dynamic route itself. Adding a bracket syntax around it in a file name essentially declares it like a dynamic route. Now, in our case, we don't want to just do this, right? We also want to read this value that's there in the URL. So how can we do that? let's go ahead and print out this specific value in the component itself on the page. So in order to do that, we need to use something called as a Next.js router. So Next.js provides us with a hook called as useRouter that allows you to route and read the values from the browser URL. So in our case, if you want to read this specific value, we can easily do that using the Next.js router. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's declare router equals useRouter, and let's import that right here. We can say useRouter from next router. Now, before we do anything, let's go ahead and console log this right now. So we can say router just to see how router looks like. Now, if we head to the browser and open up the browser DevTools and go to the console, you can see that router is in fact an object. And if we open that up, there are a lot of values in this object, a lot of keys in this object. But if we take a look at query, you will notice that this specific ID that we entered right here is available right here. So we can change this to ABC and open this up, and this query is now ABC. So if we go to our editor and essentially just say router.query.id, because that's where it's located, router.query.id, and hit save, there you go. ABC is printed right here. And that's the beauty of using Next.js router. Now, how this ID gets generated and how we will utilize it, let's take a look at that in a future lesson. But now that we have learned different types of routing, let's go ahead and learn about linking these routes in the next lesson. All right, I'll see you in the next one.